Hi guys, it's Pastor Kerry, and I'm not only a pastor, but also a Reasonable Faith chapter director. And last night we had our chapter meeting, another chapter meeting at at what we call the barn. It's the little building behind our church, and we tried to broadcast that, but the broadcast just didn't work. And so what I wanted to do was just to come to my home studio here today and share with you some of the material that we covered there last night. And so let's just go ahead. I'll jump in. I got some slides here I'd like to share with you about what if atheism is true. But first, I guess it'd be good if we could talk a little bit about Swiss cheese. and particularly Emmental. I didn't realize that is the variety of Swiss cheese that has the largest holes in it. And the only reason why I share that with you right now is because when it comes to worldviews, that all worldviews are going to leave some holes in our understanding of reality. But some worldviews have bigger holes than others. And I think atheism falls into that category. And so that's what I'd like to share with you here this afternoon. Let me just get back here and click on that. There we go. So, wow, man, my camera's jumping around on me. Let's just try this way. I failed to lock this down earlier, and now maybe that will work. Let's try it. I'll lock it down right now. Okay, so like I said, we're playing a game of what if atheism is true, and that. And we're talking here about a particular variety of atheism, and that's the atheism that says that only material things, only the natural realm exists, that there's nothing spiritual that exists. Now, some varieties of atheism are spiritual. Buddhism actually is one of those varieties of atheism that is spiritual, and that it is a religion that is agnostic about the existence of God. And so a lot of people kind of think that all religions believe, or at least have some sort of idea about God, but at least Buddhism, and there may be other ones too, where they don't make any proclamations about God and his existence. And so, but let's go ahead and we'll just kind of plow through this presentation here today. I think that probably the best modern expression of atheism, humanism, atheism, is found in John Lennon's song Imagine. Imagine there's no heaven, so we've taken heaven, the supernatural, out of the picture. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. And what Lennon is advocating here in these particular lyrics is that he's advocating a version, or at least a worldview, an understanding of reality that is called materialism. And it's also, a variety of atheism. And so let's look at this and do a little bit of imagination, because what the atheist is saying, that that nature is all there is, that God doesn't exist. So think about this for a moment, because this is an important concept that we're going to kind of expand on throughout our talks. And I'm hoping to just look at a portion of the implications of atheism in this particular talk, and look at other aspects of it in other talks. But that if nature is all there is, then everything must ultimately be explained naturally. And that's a profound concept, that everything ultimately has to be be explained scientifically. And so, like I say, that's a profound concept, because that's just really, the atheist will run into a lot of walls when they try to force fit reality into that understanding. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm anti-science, quite the contrary, that I respect and admire science, and that, but not everything that scientists says is scientific. And so sometimes scientists like to kind of intone in areas of philosophy and other areas of reality. And, the gullible public, and, the longer I live, the more I realize that common sense is just not that common, is that the gullible public will listen to a scientist talk about certain aspects of reality that he's not credentialed to speak upon, and just take it as gospel truth. So first and foremost, let me just kind of tell you straight up front that I'm not a scientist. I understand that, but I am a thinker, and I like to think about things and think about their implications, and that's what we're talking about here, is that what if atheism is true? And so, there's a lot of big things about reality that atheism just cannot explain. And those big things about reality can be classified into two main groups: things about nature and things about human experience. So let's look at these natural things first. Is that, what I like to do from time to time, because anybody who knows me well knows that I've struggled with doubts all throughout my Christian life, and I've really made it my personal enterprise to be able to answer those doubts that I have. And God has been gracious, and He's helped me in to find good answers to many of the questions that I have. That doesn't mean I have all the answers. It just means that I've thought seriously about some of these topics and have found some good answers. But one of the things that I like to do from time to time is I like to just take a brief inventory of nature and human experience. Because when it comes to a worldview, when it comes to an explanation of reality, that it can't just explain one aspect of reality. It has to be comprehensive in its scope. And this is where I see atheism truly breaking down, because it just does not have answers to many of the big questions that human beings like to ask. And so that's one of the things that we'll be looking at as we go along here. But when I do this inventory, that when I think about nature, the natural realm, and then I think about human experience, I further divide that down into the inorganic natural realm, or so the non-living matter, and then we have the organic realm of nature. And there's just a whole lot of things that atheism just seems to be unable to explain about even the realm of nature. For instance, the origin of life, the fine-tuning of the universe, the origin of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, the origin of life, the information that we find in DNA, and the complexity of biological systems, and the diversity of those, and also consciousness. So we're going to we'll be touching on those concepts in this particular presentation. But then what we'll do is that in a future presentation, we'll be talking about other areas of reality that atheism just really has a horrible time explaining, and that includes things like rationality, morality, free will, purpose, meaning, value, and destiny, and even human rights, justice, and law. So we'll be taking a look at some of those. But let's just go ahead and we'll just keep on moving through here. If I can get my presentation to advance, I don't know what, there we go. So when we're talking about the explanations that atheism, the implications of atheism, and particularly with respect to nature, that's all I'm looking at in this presentation, is the natural realm. Is that there's one natural thing that atheism has a very difficult time explaining, and that's how does atheism account for the origin of nature, or the origin of the universe? And since we know that there's a Big Bang, we have to ask ourselves, who or what lit the fuse? And you can't appeal to nature to explain nature. Remember, I said at the start, at the top end of our broadcast here, is that the atheist says that only the natural realm exists. So that means that all explanations have to be natural or scientific explanations. And so it's you can't appeal to nature to explain the existence, the origin of nature, the origin of our time-space continuum. And that would be like trying to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And so there we go. I think that we jumped ahead. My computer is acting up here again. But that's okay. We're going to get past all of this. But the atheist will then ask, well, what about the multiverse? And it's the idea that our universe is just one bubble in a vast sea of bubbles, with each being its own universe. And if you remember the first installment of Men in Black, there was a dog that had a collar and had a little bauble on that collar, and inside that collar was a universe, a universe within our universe type of thing. And so, and the multiverse, it has a lot of popularity when it comes to science fiction. But here's below this line are all the scientific facts that we know about the multiverse. So it's a theory, it's conjecture, it's just an idea, one possible, there's plenty of possible explanations. It's possible that unicorns exist, but that doesn't mean that they exist in reality. And so, like I said, below this line are all the scientific facts that we know about the multiverse. The second natural thing that atheism has a hard time explaining is how does atheism account for the fine-tuning of the universe? I've been studying this whole area of Christian apologetics for a long time in my life, just like I said, in order to answer my own personal doubts and struggles. But it wasn't really until recently that I started to do a little bit more study in this area of the fine-tuning of the universe. And what that really means is that it's talking about the laws that govern physical reality. In order for for physical reality to exist and operate, that those laws have a razor-thin precision that characterizes them. Now, imagine walking out in the woods one day and you come upon a cairn of stones carefully balanced upon each other. And even though these stones are natural objects, what would be the most reasonable conclusion respecting their arrangement or how they're ordered? And when I saw something like this, personally, the first thought that would come to my mind is that somebody did this. And so it's just that type of precision that you see, even though all of these are just natural objects, and that following the laws of physics, that my first thought is that somebody put it together this way. But, that's not the only possible explanation. People could say that, well, it's necessity, that maybe there's a yet to be discovered force of nature that compelled these stones to arrange themselves exactly in this way. Or chance, and maybe the stream flooded and in the aftermath of spilling over its banks, the stones were arranged like this by chance. Or the other possibility, if we're going to talk possibilities, the other possibility is design. Maybe someone had a purpose in mind, and that's why these stones were arranged like that. Well, how might we tell? The fine-tuning argument seeks to answer that question. By fine-tuning, we mean that in order for life to exist in the universe, the ingredients, the fundamental constants, the strong and weak nuclear force, electromagnetism, and gravity, that those are, and that's at least the four basic ones. There's 22 others that had to be kind of cooked up just so and measured out in the right proportions in order for our universe to exist. Too much of one or too little of another would have rendered life to be impossible. The fine-tuning argument says that God is the best explanation for such precision. My friend Ian Davis in Wales, he gave me this illustration of when I once spoke with him about this argument. He says, think of it this way. If you wanted to bake a cake, you would need to pay attention to a couple important elements of cake baking. First, you would need all the right ingredients, and you would need to have the right amount of each ingredient. Too much or too little flour, and the cake would be ruined, and the same goes with salt and sugar and baking powder and eggs. Then you'd need to not only have the right ingredients, but you'd have to combine them and cook up your ingredients in the right way. Too much or too little time in the oven, and everything could be ruined. And the same goes for cooking up a life-permitting universe. You need both the right ingredients and the right procedure to end up with a habitable environment. And so that's kind of the essence of the fine-tuning argument. And when you look at necessity, that the universe did not have to be the way it is, and you look at chance, you look at the astronomical, no pun intended, but the astronomical odds of our universe being ordered the way that it is at the end of the day, it's kind of like those stones. How did those stones get arranged in that cairn the way that they did? Is that you could say necessity, you could say chance, but the best explanation is design. Here's what one atheist says, and it never ceases to amaze me, the candor that some atheists have, despite the fact that they persist in their atheism. A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed. So he says, if you just think about it commonsensical, that a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics as well as the chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seems to me to be so overwhelming as to put this conclusion beyond question, and that's the astronomer Fred Hoyle. He's deceased now, but from him, and he, to my knowledge, he persisted in his atheism. But he says, you look at the world around us, and he says it just doesn't make any sense to think that this just happened by chance. And there's certainly no physical necessity that forced everything to kind of like unfold the way that it did. So atheism, we're talking about the implications of atheism. And atheism has a hard time explaining the origin of nature because you can't use nature to explain the origin of nature. And obviously, you could punt to the multiverse, but the multiverse is just science fiction and not science fact. Secondly, is that we have the fine-tuning of the universe, in that when we see that the universe cannot be accounted for, this life-permitting universe cannot be accounted for through physical necessity or through chance. The only other option is design, that it was designed that way, and design implies a designer. Natural thing number 3 that atheism has a hard time accounting for, and that's the information that we find in DNA. Now, DNA is both a molecule, but it's also a molecule that transports information. So there are two separate things. The ATCG molecules or bases within the DNA molecule are different from its information. You see, DNA is not just a complex molecule. It's a molecule that transports information. I think I just said that. But it possesses two distinct features. One is its physical structure, but secondly is its informational component. And that's where atheists just cannot account for the information. I don't even think they can account sufficiently for the structure of the DNA, but the information that is found in DNA. You see, think of it this way, is that just as paper and ink, that just as the paper and ink of an instruction manual is different from the information it contains. So in other words, that instruction manual could be a PDF file, and it could be digital, or it could be Morse code, or it could be sent as an email attachment, or it could be written out on paper and ink. And so the physical mechanisms that transport the information is different from the information itself. And so are the molecules that transport the information in DNA. The molecules of DNA are distinct from the information that they convey. And as we know that DNA is the blueprint for life, is that every organism, every living organism, that it depends on DNA for what type of organism it becomes. And science has no explanation how that information got into the DNA code. Bill Gates says this: DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created. Now, we know that some software may behave as if there is no mind behind it, but we still know that any software, any information requires a mind to exist. And so it's kind of like if you were walking out on the beach one day, and you know that or maybe instead illustrate it this way, is that if you had only these Scrabble tiles, O space V space R J N O S M Y H L E A, if you had only those Scrabble tiles and you mixed them up in your tossing jar there and tossed them out on the table, is that those random forces, I don't know how many times you'd have to toss it, but I just don't think you'd ever come up with John loves Mary, because we know that random forces, information is the product of mind. By the way, if you shook it up and you tossed it out and it spelled it out perfectly, John loves Mary, is that you probably think that there's something up with that. And so, same if you're walking along the beach and the ocean waves just lapped up and they spelled out there on the sand, life is a beach. Is that we understand that information, behind information is a mind. And that, by the way, is not just a personal preference. Is that's a scientific reality. We see that information producing systems, or information itself, is always the product of a mind. Is that we never see any indication that just the random forces of nature produce information. And so we're talking about the implications of atheism and the things that atheism, it just cannot explain, maybe even, or it just does not explain, and maybe even cannot explain. And natural thing number 4 is that how does atheism account, how does materialism, that there is no supernatural component to reality, that it's just the blind forces of nature operating, then how does atheism account for biological complexity? And so a single cell has many molecular machines that are far more complex than anything Darwin could imagine. Now, we don't fault him for that, because he lived back in the 19th century when he wrote his book, The Origin of Species. But since that time, that the whole scientific discipline of molecular biology has just exploded. And the more that science discovers, the more complex that we see that even the individual cell, and that the individual cell could not exist apart from this assembly of these complex components to it. Michael Behe, who is a molecular biologist who teaches at Lehigh University, he says this: if you search the scientific literature on evolution, and if you focus your search on the question of how molecular machines, the basis of life, developed, you find an eerie and complete silence. The complexity of life's foundation has paralyzed science's attempts to account for it. Molecular machines raise an as yet impenetrable barrier to Darwinism's universal reach. So what he's saying is that the molecular machines that we find even in the simplest of cells are far too complex to just have randomly organized through processes that we have no clue of how that they would work. And so Michael Denton says this: molecular biology has shown that even the simplest of all living systems on the earth today, bacterial cells, are exceedingly complex objects. Although the tiniest bacterial cells are incredibly small, weighing less than 10 to 12 grams each, is in effect a veritable micro-miniaturized factory containing thousands of exquisitely designed pieces of intricate molecular machinery made up altogether of 100,000 million atoms, far more complicated than any machine built by man, and absolutely without parallel in the non-living world. So giving an explanation to how did that happen is that the atheist can offer no plausible explanation for that. And just how complex, for instance, is the human cell? Well, take a look at the most detailed model of the human cell. This is a photograph, actually, of a human cell. I've looked this up on the internet. There's a site where you can go and they have overlays of all the functions of the various parts of this particular photograph. And I thought, obviously some of these little dots that we see there are just maybe debris that's inside the cell. And no, all of these things perform a function. And when you begin to look at how complex that is, that it just borders on unbelievability that this happened just by chance. I would say not a chance. It happened by chance. So, natural thing number 5 about the implications of atheism, things that atheists and the natural, when somebody takes a materialistic viewpoint on life, on their worldview, is that natural thing number 5 that atheism just does not account for is how does atheism account for the abrupt appearance of biological diversity. You see, I was taught in school, we got this whole chain of evolution that goes all the way back to the simplest bacterium, and then bam, that the whole thing through natural selection and random mutations just worked its way into upwards into, or the descent to man, I guess. But that's just not what the fossil record shows. Is that the fossil record shows that that 530 million years ago, many animals suddenly appeared and without any apparent ancestors. And Stephen C. Meyer, he says this: if Darwin is right, Agassiz argued, then we should not find just one or a few missing links, but innumerable links shading almost imperceptibly from our alleged ancestors to presumed descendants. Geologists, however, have found no such myriad of transitional forms leading to the Cambrian fauna. Instead, the stratigraphic column seems to document the abrupt appearance of the earliest animals. And so, finally, natural thing number 6 that atheism just does not account for, and that's the fact that human beings are thinking beings, is that we are conscious, and that I think, therefore I am, Descartes said. And that raises a number of questions. Does matter think? Is matter self-aware? Does matter have emotions? Does matter choose? And, it gets pretty bizarre if you think that all that there is matter and nothing spiritual exists. And so Thomas Nagel, who is also an atheist, he says this: materialism is incomplete even as a theory of the physical world. I just find this so remarkable that, once again, the candor of some atheists on the limitations and the inadequacies of atheism. He says materialism is incomplete even as a theory of the physical world, since the physical world includes conscious organisms among its most striking occupants. And so he goes on to say this: I want atheism to be true and am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent, well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God, and naturally I hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope that there is no God. And so you see some of this, some of the motivation. And, atheists oftentimes kind of throw this in the face of religious believers. But some of the motivation that, sometimes the motivation behind atheism is a person's psychology. And it's not that the facts have driven them into atheism as much as that I hope that there is no God, and I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. And so, by the way, Professor Nagel, is that you don't get a vote. Is that the Creator organizes the world the way He sees fit, and even if we don't like it, is that He's not going to adjust reality to our liking. So finally, we started off and we were talking about Swiss cheese and all the holes in it, and the Swiss cheese that has the most holes in it is Emmental Swiss cheese. And I think that when we begin to take a closer look at atheism and the implications that it holds for explaining not just maybe a narrow bandwidth of reality, but all the different components, like I talked about earlier in the presentation, of reality, the natural world, the inorganic matter, and organic life, the human experience that we encounter, both individually and as a society. So when it comes to explaining the important features of nature, atheism is riddled with holes. It's a Swiss cheese worldview. But that's just the start of its problems. If atheism is true, it gets worse when we turn our attention to human experience. And that's what I hope to do in our next visit. And so I would just encourage you to continue to hang with me on these programs or catch them when they come along. Every once in a while I'll be posting a new one. And so and the next time that we get together, we'll be talking about the implications of atheism and its implications for us individually as a worldview. And so that's it for now. Hey, thanks for watching.